As I mentioned earlier on, we invited Kath and Heather and Kathleen together, and we had a series of conversations, and it was really talking about, as I said at the beginning, the past, what's happening in the present, and what's needed for the future. And in the process of that conversation, what emerged for us was a couple of C's, well, more than a couple of C's, 4 C's. And we thought that we would shape the rest of the conversation and the contribution from the panelists around those 4 C's. And they were all in relationship to natural resource management and facilitation. And the first C was around context, the role of facilitation and understanding the bigger picture, what's happening in this particular situation. The role of facilitation in connection, connection to the land, connection to others and their issues. The role of facilitation in conflict, and that really emerged as a big underlined C in our conversation, which was repeated across many different scenarios. And then the role of facilitation in culture. So what we'd love to do is we're going to invite our panelists to just share and have a conversation amongst themselves around those 4 C's. But first of all, I'm going to ask each of them to just tell us for about 90 seconds, their thoughts around facilitation. Let's start with the connection C. So we'll just have that conversation. So Jamie, if you could just spotlight Kathleen and Kath and Heather, and we'll let them have a conversation amongst themselves.
I can start if you like.
Great.
Facilitation for me is certainly about enabling connection and enabling, particularly learning is so important to me in natural resource management because nobody has all the answers, and making connections that enable people to learn from others and to learn from others' experience and share knowledge is so important. I'm really interested in how we create these relationships and connections, both within groups of, farmers or industry leaders or politicians, but then also connecting them multi-scale, across scales, so that they can talk to each other across scales and across groups, so that we have some more interesting conversations about where we can go.
Mm. Yeah, good, Kathleen. I'll jump in if you like. Yeah, totally agree that for me as a facilitator, I think a big role is facilitating those connections, connecting the people, connecting them to the topic of what our conversation is about, and connecting them to place as well. So there's various processes that you might use, but certainly from a facilitation point of view, always really thinking about how will you maximize people's connection to each other, to the topic, and to the place where we're at. And I think unless you do that well, it's difficult for deeper conversations to unfold.
Mm.
Gosh, thanks, Kath. I really like what you talked about place, because it's going to segue into my thoughts around connection. And when I think of connection, I have this little phrase. I think of, I'm on a journey of 1,000 cups of tea. So it's about taking time to get to know people. And, as facilitators, as our role is to create that space, and we need to allow time for people to get to know each other and taking time to build a connection. Now, me being me, I'm going to tell a random story. So many, many, many moons ago, when I was a lot younger, I worked for the Hawke's Bay Regional Council, and I was the land care facilitator. And I remember sitting with my manager, and I told him I wanted to change my KPIs, how he could know if I was doing a good job. So what I said to him was, I said, if I'm out with farmers and I get invited in for a cup of tea, that's a win. I'm doing good. But if I get invited in for lunch, that's an absolute double win, and I should get a pay rise. And because, you know, that means people want to talk to you. They want to build that connection. You know, a couple of weeks ago, someone said to me, God damn, all you ever do is have cups of tea with people. And, you know, the problem with that is there's that unspoken that that's not real work. You don't do anything. So my takeaway from all of this is being on a journey of 1,000 cups of tea tells other people, you know, I'm interested in you. You know, I want to know more about you. I want to hear your stories. And when we share our stories, we start to hear each other and we start to understand each other. And really key in natural resource management, we find that common ground. So for me, being on a journey of 1,000 cups of tea is taking time to build connections and think about our future. Kia ora.
Great.
That's so awesome, Heather. It reminds me when we were having this conversation, you introduced me to the concept of shiny pants. The shiny pants don't like having all of those cups of tea. So thanks for the reminder of that story. So Kathleen, why don't you share with us a little bit about around the whole thing of facilitation and context and your thoughts around that? That'd be awesome.
Yeah, sure. I'm thinking that context is really critical to good facilitation, and for having, if you are working on natural resources as a facilitator, you really do need to be aware of the context. So Chris talked about earlier about this vibrant network of facilitators that we had all over the country in Australia and also I think in New Zealand. For many years, you know, building up from soil management days, early days of land care, right through to the current day. And we've been through lots of different cycles in that time. But just to backtrack a little bit, I think having some understanding about natural resources. I mean, Kath said she was a soil scientist. I'm a human geographer. I don't know that that qualifies me, but certainly an understanding of people. And I know Heather's got such a great background in farming and in agriculture more broadly. So she, you know, bringing that to bear on your facilitation, I think is important. Just even understanding the complexity of the context in which you're working. You know, natural resources include water, soil, biodiversity, coasts. Can include fisheries, can include, you know, lots of different areas of natural resource management. And any of those, you're not going to be an expert in all of them, but to have some understanding about the complexity of the topic of natural resources and the relationship of people to natural resources is really critical. And I did mention that it's important to think across scales. From a landholder working on their own property, and we work in facilitating their learning and understanding and learning from them as well, their tacit knowledge of their land and their practices, right through to you know, government structures that enable people to collaborate and work together, and the shiny pants that understand that good facilitation is really needed to make lasting change. So scale is important as well. I think a lot of us focus on the structure and the institutional arrangements. Like if you asked me, do I work in NRM, I'd say, oh yes, I work with these people and this structure. So briefly in Australia, you know, we've got these 56 natural resource management regions. We've got a really healthy and vibrant and growing actually land care network. It's going through a bit of a revitalisation across the country. In New Zealand, we have regional councils that undertake catchment management, and vibrant organisations like the New Zealand Land Care Trust that provide networking and sharing opportunities across land care groups and friends of groups. All of us are looking at ways to provide resources to support that activity. And increasingly we're engaging industry as well and encouraging stewardship of natural resources across, for example, I've been working in water stewardship with organisations that run flour mills and dairies, because that's just as important on a different scale and in a different way to the outcome for natural resources, to be able to facilitate these people working together to get better understanding and to develop practices that are conducive to good natural resource management. But I think mainly the facilitation is about process. So we're about holding a process or holding a space for people to come together, to interact with knowledge, to interact with each other, and to develop some new skills and knowledge to apply and to make change, because we're all focused on making change and making outcomes, good outcomes happen. If I had two things to say of a takeaway, I'd say critical at this juncture in time is to have a systems view, to understand how everything we do and every job we're asked to do or facilitation task is can be seen within a bigger system, a bigger, broader system. And I'm really interested in the governance of natural resource management systems, and also the complexity of people skills that comprise a facilitator's knowledge. I think are really, it's really important that we understand that to change people's ways of viewing and behaving and acting in the world, we have to really have a pretty good handle on a lot of social science, psychology, sociology, even economics, understanding how people are motivated in different ways to make change. So yeah, I think I'll leave you with that. So my big two takeouts are really having a systems view and having an awareness of the people skills needed. What do you think, Kath?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Kathleen. So the C that I'm talking about is conflict, and I guess when I think about my journey, I trained in facilitation while I was with the Department of Ag, and my main job there was to work with farmer discussion groups, and so hence my interest then in facilitation, so I could facilitate good conversations that enable people to learn and change behaviour, as Kathleen has been talking about. Moving on from that and starting out as a private consultant in facilitation, I was just starting to notice that more and more of my work was based in conflict. So this is where communities are in conflict with government, organisations or companies over the management of natural resources. So in some cases, it was things like water, it was things like developments that might be occurring on agricultural land or in natural spaces. Conflicts over the fire management of forests, landfill, management of corellas on golf courses. There you go. One of my more bizarre jobs. And what I was noticing is that while there was, in most organisations, there are facilitation skills internally, a lot of them were not wanting to touch conflict issues. And so they were looking for an external facilitator. So with that in mind, I then completed a graduate certificate in mediation and conflict resolution, and also did some further study and training in group conferencing models for conflict resolution. So this gave me ways to approach facilitation of conversations between communities and relevant authorities and organisations when we're talking about contested views and perspectives. And what I was finding was that there are lots of crossovers between mediation, conflict resolution and facilitation. So many of the processes and skills are similar, but perhaps there's a greater emphasis on some aspects. And so I guess for me that the takeouts would be that real focus on the importance of helping people to listen to each other for understanding someone else's perspective. So helping everyone understand you don't have to agree with someone to understand them. And that's the most important aspect. Helping people to really focus on the issues that matter to them. So really starting to pull out what are the most important issues here from your perspective, rather than allowing the overwhelm feeling of, you know, the whole complexity, is to really focus in on, so what are the key issues here? And then really focusing on options to explore. So rather than finding the answer, let's see what are the range of options that we could then explore. So I guess for me, thinking about the future from a facilitation point of view, you know, particularly here in Northeast Victoria, what I'm seeing is we have real challenges with climate change, intersecting with real challenges with population growth, hence urban growth, urban encroachment into the area. So I think conflict over how we manage natural resources is only going to continue and increase, and good facilitation skills are absolutely vital in those circumstances. So yeah, that's the C for conflict. Over to you, Heather.
Gosh, thanks, Kath. You know, and conflict leads into my C, which is culture. And what I want you to, I guess a way to connect the two, for what I've been thinking about, is that a lack of understanding for culture and a disrespect for culture can lead to conflict. So what I'm going to do today is talk about culture in two ways. First one's going to be about group culture and how we as facilitators create culture for safe conversations. And the other thing I want to do is explore culture and ethnicity, you know, different cultures in the world. Now, my culture is to involve people. So I'm going to pose some questions for you, and I really want you to talk to each other in the chat box as we go. Okay, so group culture. What I want you to do is take a moment and think about group culture. Then I'd like you to pop into the chat box. When you think about group culture, what springs to mind? So you share your ideas. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what it means for me. For me, it's around tikanga, which is the Te Reo word for behaviour. And that's how we work together. You know, what's important to us? How will we treat each other? And I'm going to share a story, as I always do. Sorry, I can't help myself, around this really large community-led landscape restoration project I've been involved with for about 18 months. So at the start of the project, we had a way of working, you know, little group, and you talk, you know, a little steering group, how are we going to work together and what are all the important things. But where we're at now is we've developed a tikanga for the whole project. And I want to share with you 3 of their values. So the first one is manaakitanga. And this is a bilingual project, so I'm going to be using Te Reo as we go, but I'll always explain it in English. So the first one is manaakitanga, which is around showing care and welcoming and hospitality. So all those cups of tea and biscuits and things you have. The second is around whanangatanga, which is building connections and trust and taking time to get to know each other. Then we have kotahitanga, which is around unity and togetherness. And a key thing for this group is that all knowledge is equally respected. So that means practical know here, what a farmer knows, what he's learned from his grandfather or his great-grandfather, the science knowledge that comes from monitoring, the Indigenous knowledge, the Mataranga Māori. And all of that is absolutely valued because we all have different ways of knowing our land and knowing our water. So all ways of knowing are equally valid. So I think my takeaway on group culture is you've always got, and I talk about time, you've always got to take time to set culture, which is taking the 5 minutes at the beginning of the meeting. How are we working together today? Do we need to check in where we're up to? What's working, what's not working? It doesn't matter if it's your first meeting or your 10th meeting with the same group. I think it's really important to keep doing that. And that sets our culture, which is our way of working as facilitators, and how we work demonstrates to others how we'd like them to work. But the one that I'd really like to unpack, which I think is quite fascinating, is ethnicity around in culture. So what we're going to explore is to think about, how can we as in people, not just us as facilitators, but we as people, how can we be respectful and inclusive of all cultures? Because I want you to think back. In the past, it was my way or the highway. I'm this white Pākehā woman, and you do it my way. We're all the same, aren't we? But now we have this ability to understand and work. And a big thing to think about is, cultures are really strongly connected with their natural resources. Māori in particular, whakapapa back, which means they're connected back to the land, they're connected back to the water, they are their ancestors. So what I want you to do, I want you to go back into the chat box. So when I talk about culturally respectful, what does culturally respectful look like for you? How does it make you feel when we're in a culturally respectful way? So I'll just take a moment. So when I introduced myself, I used an English version of my pepeha. I talked about where I was from, talked about my family history, I talked about my connections to the land, I talked about my mountain, I talked about my river, I talked about my family. So you developed a sense of who I was, where I was from, and my strong connections with the land and water. So pepeha is how Māori introduce themselves, and it tells a story of places and the people they're connected to and how they whakapapa back to the land. And Kath's mentioned about place, and I think that one thing to really remember is sharing stories builds connections and trust. So I was in a Zoom, I don't know, last week, I can't remember, they all just end up as one. It was an hour and a half, and it was starting to co-design this huge multi-year social science research project around people's connection to place. And I thought, there's absolutely no way we can do this work in an hour and a half. So we spent the first 45 minutes on connections. We built connections. We got the work done in 30 minutes, and we spent the last 15 minutes chatting about the weather. Now, if we'd started with the work and who I am, we would have still been arguing. So what was people used to always introduce themselves by what they do. So I'm Heather, and I'm from the regional council, and I'm a really smart, I don't know what, policy person. But what I do now, and what will be in the future, I hope, is that get people to explain where they're from. These are my connections. I'm from here. This is how I'm connected to my land. This is why looking after the water is so important to me, because as a child I fished and whatever. I think it's also important to understand the subtle cues and rules, and they're really key. And as facilitators, we need to be aware of what's going on. We use those in a design phase, checking on local customs and practices, blessing food before you eat, a karakia before you eat. Is that important in all cultures, and who does it? Understanding who does it is really important. You get that wrong, and when is it done? And at Samoan, another culture, and the young don't speak before their elders. So if you've got young and elders in the room, how do the young have their voice? And there's a big one. We use a lot of Thai contractors in the vineyard. Now, as New Zealanders, we go, oh, how's it going, mate? And you look someone in the eye and you shake their hand, but the Thai don't work like that. So when they meet someone, it's this. So they look down. So to look at someone in the eye is really disrespectful. So if I put my hand out to a Thai contractor and looked at them, they'd look away and be really embarrassed. So I know that, so I know how to treat them with respect. But I'm going to finish with a personal reflection, and this is quite a big thing for me. I've only just realised it. So what was? I used to worry about my te reo. I used to be absolutely terrified of saying it wrong, particularly on the marae, and causing offence. So what has happened is I've learnt that fluent Today speakers value, respect, and thank me for trying to speak Te Reo, and it's respect for their culture. And what will be is authenticity, and that comes from the heart. So if you're authentic about respecting culture, it's not just a tick box again, oh, I've got to do this, got to check the Māori involved, check the Samoans are happy and Thais are happy. It's about being authentic, about wanting to respect culture, and that gives you the confidence to try. Kia ora.
Thank you, Kathleen and Kath and Heather. I mean, it was just amazing how the 4 Cs were interconnected throughout that whole conversation. And if there was one C that seemed to be stronger amongst them, from my perspective, it seemed to be the connection as being a strong part of all of them. There's been some really great comments and questions that are coming up in the chat box. We're going to be going in a minute to some breakout rooms so that we can dive into some of that, and some of those questions that come up in the chat, we'll ask you to explore those yourselves. But whilst we're waiting for that, I'm going to spotlight Rachel and just now I've got to find you, Rachel, so that we can see what Rachel's been doing in the background before we go to the breakout rooms. So Rachel, are there? Do you want to have a chat with everybody?
Yeah, well, there was a very strong sense of connection, as you pointed out, and I really loved that thread of the story of self and the story of place. To me, it's like bringing your whole self into your facilitation, and in doing that, you kind of light the way for other people to bring their whole selves, and that will help them listen to others. And yeah, and it also is inclusive of all the knowledge that people bring. So yeah, that's what stood out to me.
Yeah, your screen's gone all blurry for a minute. I'm not sure if it's just me or it's everybody.
That's blurry for me too, SJ.
Yeah. Maybe it's just a bandwidth issue.
It might be. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear you perfectly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that, and this will be an artifact that all of you will receive afterwards. So please don't fret. So I'm going to throw over to Huff, and I'm sure that it did for me. That's the second time I've been involved in that conversation, but it's definitely evolved around those 4 Cs, and I'm sure it emerged a lot of things for you. And Huff's just going to shape us up for a conversation that we're going to have in small breakout rooms. So over to you,